Berlin, 1927. There's a cafe near the university where the psychologists like to argue, and one waiter who never writes anything down. 12 orders, 15. He keeps every plate and every coffee in his head, perfectly, for as long as you keep sitting there. Then you pay. And here's the strange part. A psychologist at the table asked him, half an hour after settling up, to recite what they'd ordered. The waiter was almost offended. He said, "I don't know any longer what you ordered. You paid your bill." The moment the check closed, his mind threw the whole table away. Your brain runs on the same rule. That text you never answered, it's still open, still running. The email you drafted and didn't send. The argument you didn't finish. Your mind holds every one of them like an unpaid check. And the ones you settled? Gone. You couldn't replay them if you tried. By the end of this video, you'll know what that open loop actually is. And I'll tell you now, the most famous fact about it turned out to be false in a way almost nobody talks about. You'll also get the one honest, tested trick that makes your brain finally let a thing go. And fair warning, this story ends somewhere much darker and much stranger than a cafe. I'm going to open a few loops in this video on purpose. Count them if you like. We'll close every one. You already know the feeling this video is about. It's 3 a.m. and your brain is replaying a conversation from 2019. It's the song that cuts off mid-chorus and keeps playing itself in your head. It's lying in the dark, suddenly remembering the form you half-filled, the message you left unread, the thing you almost said. None of it is urgent. All of it is unfinished. And your brain treats unfinished like a fire alarm with no off switch. In 1927, a very small woman in Berlin decided to measure that alarm. Her name was Zeigarnik, Lithuanian, mid-20s, one of a circle of brilliant young women doing psychology in Berlin under Kurt Lewin, the professor from the cafe story. She was so short she never lectured from behind a podium, because nobody would have seen her. She bought her coats a size too large, her family said, because she perceived herself as taller than she was, which, honestly, might be the most psychologist thing I've ever heard. Lewin's circle had a hunch. An interrupted task isn't just paused, it stays live, like a circuit still carrying current. Zeigarnik's job was to catch that current in the act. So she sat people down, 164 of them across her experiments, students, teachers, children, and gave them little tasks. Mold an animal out of clay, fold paper, wind thread, solve a puzzle. 20-ish tasks each, a few minutes apiece. Half the time, she let them finish. The other half, she waited for the exact moment they were most absorbed. Her own notes describe a man shaping a clay dog at the point where, quote, "there's still grave danger his dog will become a cat." And right then, she'd slide the next task across the table and say, "Now do this, please." No explanation. Interrupted, mid-dog. At the end, she cleared the table like the session was over, just tidying up, nothing to see, and then asked, casually, "What were the tasks you worked on today?" People remembered the interrupted tasks about twice as well as the finished ones. 26 of her 32 main subjects showed it. The interrupted tasks weren't just remembered more, they came out of people's mouths first, 3 times as often. In children, it was even stronger. Some kids remembered only the unfinished tasks, and some begged to come back and finish them days after the experiment ended. And she ran the controls that make this actually clever. Tasks that were interrupted but then finished later, forgotten like any finished task. So it wasn't the drama of being interrupted that stuck. It was the openness, the loop being left open. Her professor called the work foundational. The finding got a name, her name, and the Zeigarnik effect entered the textbooks. Unfinished business is remembered better. Hold that sentence, because it's about to fall apart. Here's what happened to that finding over the next century. It became one of psychology's greatest hits. Productivity books built systems on it. Marketers used it to explain cliffhangers, jingles, notifications. The internet turned it into a slogan. Open loops occupy RAM. If you've ever heard that your brain is a browser with too many tabs open, that's Zeigarnik's clay dog, wearing a hoodie. Funny thing about the name, though, Zeigarnik didn't coin it. The term Zeigarnik effect first appears in 1953, in a paper showing the effect changes depending on your personality. It got its name and its first asterisk in the same breath. And the asterisks were there from the start, buried in her own dissertation, where almost nobody reads. Tire people out, she found, and the effect reverses. Wait a single day, and it shrinks by more than half. In one experiment, she called people away afterward for an important phone call. There was no call. The line was silent. Everyone laughed. And one participant came back and said, quote, "I have forgotten the whole thing." One phone call. That's how fragile the century's favorite memory effect was, on page 1, in 1927, in her own handwriting. Then people started checking. A German researcher failed to find it in 1930, 3 years in. By 1950, one reviewer wrote, and this is a real quote about a scientific method, "When a research operation requires as much discussion of its psychological meaning as interruption does, it is time to find a new operation." That's academic for stop. And then there's my favorite scientist in this whole story, Annie van Bergen. In the 1960s, in Amsterdam, she reran Zeigarnik's experiments exactly. Same design, same interruption timing, in her own home, 34 subjects at her kitchen table, 7 experiments. Every single one failed. Her interrupted to completed ratio wasn't 1.9, it was 0.88, slightly worse memory for unfinished tasks. She ended her dissertation by calling her own topic a non-problem that should be discarded. She was a replication crisis scientist 50 years before the replication crisis had a name. And in 2025, someone finally added it all up. A meta-analysis out of Bern took every Zeigarnik study they could find, 38 publications, 100 years of arguing, and pooled them. The interrupted to completed recall ratio across everything, 0.99. A coin flip. Interrupted tasks made up 49% of what people recalled. 50 would be chance. The most famous memory effect in psychology is not a memory effect. Even the origin story doesn't survive. Remember the waiter? There are 2 published versions of that cafe anecdote. In one, the waiter forgets the bill. In the other, told by the man who was actually at the table, he forgets the orders and snaps at Lewin for asking. 2 memories of the same evening, contradicting each other. The founding anecdote of a memory effect is itself a false memory. First loop from the intro, closed, just not the way you expected. So, a century of tabs and RAM metaphors built on a coin flip. If that were the whole story, I'd end the video here and tell you to unsubscribe from psychology. It's not the whole story, because something in Zeigarnik's lab was real. It just wasn't the memory. Go back to 1927. Same building, same circle, different desk. Zeigarnik's colleague, another of Lewin's émigré students, Maria Ovsiankina, born in Siberia, asked a slightly different question. Not, do people remember unfinished tasks, but, left alone with them, do people go back? 91% did. Interrupt someone, leave the unfinished thing within reach, give them an idle moment, and 9 people out of 10 pick it back up. Nobody asks them to. Many can't even say why. In 2020, researchers reran the idea on 875 people playing a match 3 game online. Mid-game, a fake network error told them to wait 60 seconds. 3/4 dismissed it and dove straight back in. The 1928 effect runs perfectly well on a Wi-Fi excuse. And when the 2025 meta-analysis pooled this effect, the urge to resume, it held. Memory advantage, coin flip. Urge to finish, about 2/3, robust. The itch is real. The memory superpower never was. The understudy outlived the star. So what is the itch, physically? Modern cognitive science rebuilt it with reaction times. Memorize 2 to-do lists and be told you'll only have to do 1 of them. Words from the list you expect to execute get recognized measurably faster. Your intentions sit in memory slightly hot, pre-activated, ready. How much faster? About 40 milliseconds. That's the mighty open loop, a 25th of a second. I love this number because it means the pop psych version, open loops are eating your RAM, is rooted in truth and wildly oversold at the same time. Your unfinished business isn't hogging memory, it's humming. A tiny standing priority, a few hundredths of a second of head start, firing every time the world brushes against it. Times every open loop you're carrying, all day. That's the 3 a.m. playlist. And here's the detail that made me sit back. When you finish a task, or genuinely cancel it, the hum doesn't just stop. Your brain actively suppresses the whole thing, below baseline. Completed intentions become measurably harder to access than neutral memories. Read that back onto the waiter. He wasn't being lazy about your order. His mind was doing exactly what minds do the instant a check closes, not filing the finished business, burying it, so the next 12 orders have the floor. Paid bills aren't forgotten, they're deleted on purpose, by a system that knows finished means gone. This is where the story lands in 2026. This year, researchers at Yale and UBC showed people simple animations, paths moving through mazes toward an endpoint. Some paths arrived, some stopped just short. Then they tested visual memory along those paths. Memory was sharper for the paths that stopped short. And here's the part I can't stop thinking about. A third of the observers never consciously noticed some paths were unfinished. Their eyes didn't register it. Their memory did. Unfinishedness isn't a thought you have. It's something your perception flags before you're aware of it. The loop opens whether or not you feel it open. And it follows you out of the lab. Studies tracking employees across weekends found that the unfinished tasks you leave on Friday predict how much your mind chews on work over the weekend and how badly you sleep. At the desk, it's measurable within minutes. Pull someone off an unfinished task, and part of their mind stays behind. The researcher Sophie Leroy named it attention residue, and their performance on the very next task drops. Here's the detail I can't get over. In her experiments, simply finishing wasn't enough to release it. Only finishing under deadline pressure let people truly move on. Quick honesty sidebar, because this niche loves to overclaim. Earworms. Everyone says stuck songs are the Zeigarnik effect. It's actually been tested, and the record is genuinely split. One careful study found that cutting a song off mid-phrase did not make it stick. What bred earworms was humming along, not the cliffhanger. Another found truncated songs did linger in the mind, but only the catchy ones. Modest support, not a law. And your unanswered texts? No one has directly studied them as open loops at all. That one's an illustration, not a finding. I'll keep telling you the difference. That's the deal on this channel. Which brings us to the one trick that actually has evidence behind it. In 2011, researchers had people stew on their unfinished errands and then try to read a detective novel, word by word, pressing a key for each word. The unfinished business wrecked their reading. Intrusive thoughts, worse comprehension, the works. In another study, just knowing you'd later have to list sea creatures A to Z was enough to tank people's puzzle scores in the meantime. That's how cheap the hum is to trigger. But one group was immune. Not the people who finished their tasks. Nobody finished anything. The people who wrote a specific plan. Where, when, what happens next. Their reading was clean. Their scores recovered. The loop released its grip. Not on completion, on knowing what happens next. Honest caveat, as always. That's one lab, 2011-era sample sizes, and no one has directly rerun it since, though independent work keeps converging on the same place from other directions. Remember attention residue? Same researcher, 2018. When people knew they'd have to rush back to unfinished work, spending about 1 minute on a ready-to-resume note, where I stopped, what comes next, and the residue loosened its grip. Their minds showed up clean for the next task. And my favorite study in this entire video, a sleep lab gave people 5 minutes before lights out. Half wrote about what they'd finished that day. Half wrote tomorrow's to-do list. The to-do list group fell asleep about 9 minutes faster, and the more specific the list, the faster they went under. One night, one lab, 57 college-age sleepers, so hold it loosely, but it points exactly where everything else points. The brain releases what it knows is handled. So the honest instruction isn't close your loops. You can't close them all. You're a person, not a checklist. It's this. Give every loop that's humming a next step specific enough that your brain believes it. Not deal with the email. Tomorrow, 9 a.m., reply yes and ask for Thursday. The file closes not on done. It closes on decided. I told you this story ends somewhere darker than a cafe. Zeigarnik published the effect in 1927 and never studied it again. Not once, in 60 more years of working life. And then the century got to work on her. In 1940, the NKVD came for her husband. His old student notebooks from Berlin, written in German, were taken as evidence of espionage. 10 years in the camps. She was left with 2 little boys, and for years she went to the Lubyanka trying to learn whether he was alive. A question that stayed open the way no laboratory task ever could. Her second dissertation was stolen by a colleague. She burned her own drafts rather than risk being called the plagiarist. A stranger billeted in her apartment during the war burned her books for heat. And in 1983, when America finally gave her its highest award in Lewin's name, the Soviet authorities would not let her travel to receive it. Her grandson wrote that she led a complete life, but certainly one with memorable interruptions. The woman who showed us we are haunted by the unfinished spent her whole life carrying loops that history refused to close, and carried them. and kept working anyway. So, count with me. The waiter story, closed. Both versions. The false fact, named. The real machinery, the itch, the hum, the burial of finished things. The trick, not done, decided. Bluma, remembered. Every loop I opened, closed, except the one you brought with you. The text, the email, the conversation. It's still humming. You felt it hum at least once in the last 17 minutes. That little tug toward your phone. That's not a flaw. That's a 98-year-old experiment, running live in your head. You know the two ways to quiet it now. Pay the bill, or write down what happens next. Either way, the table clears. New whys here every week. What your brain does next, that's a loop I'm leaving open.